This is History 2301, Texas History, another lecture on our trip through Texas via geography. In previous lectures, we've talked about the Colorado River, and now we move down the rivers of Texas kind of in a southwesterly pattern towards San Marcos and New Braunfels. But yet at the same time, we're still dealing with a geographical compartment of Texas known as the Balcones Escarpment. Balcones Escarpment basically runs along I-35 from about Waco, roughly a little north of Waco, westward, and it runs down I-35 more or less all the way to San Antonio. So for those of you, and many of you have done this, you've driven from San Antonio to Austin or Austin to Waco to Dallas sort of territory. But especially between Austin and San Antonio, if you're on I-35 headed northward from San Antonio or Austin, you look out to your left, which would be west. You would look out and you would see not mountains, you would see hills, see I'm a Texan, and so sometimes I want to use the term mountains when in reality they're just simply hills compared to real mountains like the Rockies or even old ones like the Appalachians. But anyways, the Balcones Escarpment basically is the rise coming out of the Blackland Prairie. It's the rise coming out of the prairies of Texas into a new geological formation. These hills are made of limestone, and much of the limestone that you see laid on Texas roads, that limestone base that may even be the rock of your parents' house that they built in your lifetime, a lot of that comes out of the hill country in one form or fashion out of quarries. Basically, there is a fault line that runs along I-35 more or less, and it's not a major fault, not like San Andreas or New Madrid or something of that nature, but it is a fault line, and it marks a definite and marked change. And you see this in San Antonio, in the city of San Antonio, just in the modern 2020 city. You'll see downtown, and you see east over there toward Schertz, Cibolo, Kirby on the east side. That's all blackland. I know that firsthand. Grandparents lived in Kirby, and that was blackland. That was old cotton land before it was settled and turned into a bedroom community in the 1950s and 60s. But if you go over toward Alamo Heights, if you go toward Trinity University, you go up toward Bulverde. Of course, Bulverde is really north of downtown San Antonio by about, 20 or 25 miles. But anyways, all that territory north up 281, or if you take 410 or 1604 on the North Loop, I'd say headed toward SeaWorld or, Fiesta, Texas. All that territory right there is the beginnings, or you were really actually in the hill country already. It's just the lowlands, in a sense, of the hill country. So what we're really going to talk about today is kind of a postscript of the Lyndon Johnson stuff that I've lectured on already. Some of it is also just simply, I'm going to start talking about New Braunfels and San Marcos and the San Marcos rivers and what have you. The reality is, when we talk about the hill country of Texas, as I've already said to you, there were attempts, and foolhardy ones, frankly, but there were attempts in the 19th and early 20th century to grow cotton and other foodstuffs in that part of the world. The problem with the hill country was, and it still remains, is that the soil is thin, it's rocky, it's unforgiving, it is not good for growing crops. That doesn't mean man won't try. Sometimes man is awfully hard-headed, and men are hard-headed. You probably know some people who would rather fail miserably and fail spectacularly than ever admit they were wrong. And sometimes we can get a herd mentality in that sense, and I think there was some of that there. It's kind of the same idea talking about geography and cotton farming out in Abilene and even Big Spring and out toward Midland. It was, this ground looks good, we can plow it, let's try it, and it doesn't rain. Well, anyhow. So for the thing I do want to spend a few moments talking about, though, and this is, again, kind of a postscript on Lyndon Johnson, and maybe something I never quite clearly said to you. I talked a lot about Johnson, and I will say this. One of the questions might have ever occurred to you, and to ask it was, why was he so popular? Why did he gain so many votes? Because he did. He was, for the most part, a popular candidate. He was a popular politician. And it goes back to his early days as a congressman and beyond. Lyndon Johnson was popular for a lot of reasons, but probably the biggest one, in my opinion, historically, was that he brought real things to the hill country of Texas, especially when he was a congressman. And even after that, while he was a senator, he never forgot where he came from, and he never forgot his early friends. And he grew up out in the hill country. And when I lecture on this now, I'm going to kind of lecture on it in the idea of the changes that are going on in Texas and frankly in the larger United States, but here specifically in Texas in the days of, they say, 1890 to 1960. I have given this form of this lecture in a U.S. History 1302 class, and it's, I think, a very good thing to remember is that how much change is going on in the United States and in Texas in, say, the period of 1890 to 1960. I did not explicitly say this when I lectured on cotton in a previous lecture over the Brazos River and how cotton was fundamental to that river's development and to the development of Waco. But I will say it explicitly now, and I'm going to tie it not just to the cotton of the black land, but also the attempted cotton in the hill country and just living in the hill country, is that the years from 1890 to 1960, and those are years that I chose that might be seemingly a bit contrived in the sense that it's a square 70 years. I'm making actually a biblical allusion to the Psalms where it says the life of a blessed man is 70 years, and anything beyond that essentially is gravy or is an extra blessing from the Almighty. But anyways, that's why I chose it. You could really stretch it back a little further into the 1870s or even the 60s, I suppose. You can maybe push it a little further toward 1970, maybe 100 years instead of 70 years. No matter, but I chose to go 1890 to 1960 for this lecture, so that's the years in question. The span of a life, basically, what one man or one woman would have seen changes in their lifetime. This is true for the hill country of Texas, and it's true for the Blackland Prairie. And if you were to pose a question to me and say, what was it that made life change and really upset all the plans? Because again, like I might have alluded to, Waco was supposed to perhaps be the great interior city of Texas because Texans don't understand in 1890 that all of their assumptions, or at least maybe 60%, 50%, many of their assumptions about what the future holds would be wrong, or things that they'd had no clue were coming, such as, say, Galveston's destruction in that hurricane of 1900, Waco being crushed by a tornado, or for that matter, the collapse of cotton, Houston and Dallas growing exponentially, in later years, Austin, San Antonio following suit as well because of air conditioning, jobs, and so on. Texas becoming a wealthy and prominent city. In 1890, you would not have expected oil to be discovered. In 1890, you would not have expected a lot of things. But this idea of foresight and good prognostication is sometimes a foolhardy thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't speculate and you shouldn't prognosticate and forecast, but to say that guy should have known better sometimes is just unreasonable because of our lack of foresight and our lack of omniscience. With regard to Texas and the man, now specifically regarding a sex, the man. I sometimes have posed the question to classes over the years, what was it that made life better? In fact, actually was the most important thing that changes the life of a man. And so I think for me, the answer is going to be the internal combustion engine. Now, you can speculate and you can think about how important the internal combustion engine is to so many people. And the fact of the matter is the internal combustion engine is a life-changing, society-altering invention. I mean, just think about it in your own life, what you have that is powered by an internal combustion engine. The engine in your car, in a sense, the engine in the jet plane that you might have flown to Texas to go to school on, or you might fly home on Thanksgiving when we dismiss and send everybody their separate ways, and on I can go. The lawnmowers, the tractors. Just think about how, especially for a society that was at the turn of the 20th century was largely agrarian, largely rural or small town, and there was still a lot of farming. How much did that internal combustion engine going forward into the 20th century make that man's life easier? No longer does a man have to follow the back end of a mule or a horse plowing a field by hand. And if you've never done that, and I've only done it very briefly and long enough to know that it is an unpleasant and a very hard job, not to mention the fact that you've got to deal with horses and more especially mules who, if they don't want to work, you can't make them work, hence the phrase stubborn as a mule. Mules are actually really smart. They can be stubborn, but they're really smart. But when they know when they're tired and done, and they stop. That's that. But you don't have to chase that anymore. All you have to do is fill that tractor up with gasoline or diesel. You have to keep a good set of points or plugs in it. If it's a gas engine, you have to keep it in repair, and that thing will keep plowing all day long. I mean, I'm thinking of this as like a Ford 8N tractor, which I'm very fond of and familiar with. Others might say John Deere, all fair and good. But also beyond the tractor, think about the internal combustion engine for the man with the truck and the fact that he can move goods now on roads that are publicly owned, whether it's the federal highway system or the state highway system or years later, the interstate highway system. But the ability to move massive quantities via tire and road, that's a big development. And it allows you to build roads where railroads could not go. So if you were to ask me what made the life of a man better and easier, I think it has to be the internal combustion engine. And that's leaving out the idea of airplanes and jet travel and so forth out there. Not saying it's unimportant, but for a Texas story and for a Texas focus, considering Texas is an agricultural state at the turn of the 20th century, that is well worth remembering. That Texas is not going to Texas is going to be changed by that internal combustion engine. His life is better. But the thing is that that's all true. And I think the bigger issue is for Lyndon Johnson to a degree and other politicians like him, New Deal politicians. I think the life-changing and thing that alters the life of a woman completely and takes her out of the dark days, the dark ages as it were, literally and figuratively, and puts her into modernity is electricity. If you were to pin me down and say, what was it that made a woman's life better? What historical advancement did it? It was electricity. Air conditioning makes Texas livable, or for that matter, the Sun Belt livable. The fact of the matter is I think electricity is the big deal for the woman. Because I said this perhaps to you. I know I normally say it in every class, it seems like, but I certainly say it in 1302, which is the second half of U.S. History Survey. But at the same time, I might have said it to you, a guy named Henry Adams, who himself was a child born in 1854. He said the boy who was born in 1854 stood closer to the year 1 than to 1900. And that's true, and this is part of that reasoning why. If you think about the Hillcountry and how desolate and how I guess you could say empty it could be, even if there are people living somewhat around you. Think about living out there as a woman. And I mentioned the fact that Sam and Rebecca Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's parents, moved out there, and Mrs. Johnson, Mother Johnson, she talked about how horrible her first year of life was. She was a woman who grew up in a town. She grew up around people, and you move out to the Hillcountry to be a farmer's wife. It's a jarring experience. And it's also not just the fact that you moved out to the Hillcountry and there ain't nobody around you, but remember, there's no electricity out there. As I might have said before to you, electricity came to cities in the United States, or in Texas for that matter, by the year 1900, 1901. So in the time period, say 1900, 1905, 1910, even medium to small town Texas had started seeing electricity strung up and run through these towns. If the money was there, meaning there were people who could afford the lights and the electricity, they would wire those communities. Fair enough. But because of the population being so sparse and spread out, and the towns that were in the Hillcountry and other places like the Hillcountry, even Central Texas where I'm sitting right now, which is not the Hillcountry, the power companies were not going to string wires out into these rural hamlets and these rural counties. It made no financial sense, frankly, for a power company or a power line company to run a whole lot of copper wire and set up a whole lot of posts to power little houses here, there, and everywhere. It's a matter of scale and so on. And what Lyndon Johnson now is going to do as a congressman, and it was underneath the overall umbrella of the New Deal, is that I think one of the great developments of the 20th century was the electrification of the United States as a whole. So that today you basically can, within reason, you can basically build a house more or less where you want to. I say that, that's why I say within reason, but you can more or less build a house wherever you want to in Texas, and you can build it and there will be electricity brought to you. Now you may have to pay a fee to get it to you because there are lines on the road and you're sitting the house back a mile off the road. Yeah, that's there. But the fact was, prior to rural electrification and all the program that comes with it, and it starts with the New Deal and finishes after the World War, the thing is that those power lines running along the public highway, those power lines were set up and paid for by the federal government in the form of a New Deal program. It used to be that I would say that, and I know some people, friends of mine, who would say that really that shouldn't have happened. The government should have paid for it, should not have paid for it, let private sector do it. The problem is that a lot of those people who lived in the country and had waited for the private sector to build those lines were waiting 30, 35, 40 years after cities were electrified. If they ain't done it yet, they probably weren't going to do it. And so I think that was one of the great gifts, as it were, programs of the New Deal, was rural electrification. And you may say, well, yeah, that's nice. How does that help Lyndon Johnson, and how does that transform life in the Hill Country? But think about everything that has to happen before you have electricity. And you can call this the story of the sad irons, And it's kind of a play on words. The sad irons are a type of iron, literally a piece of metal, and the sad iron, like I said, it's a play on words because it has really a double meaning, a double entendre. Yes, it's a type, but it's also kind of the sad irons of the woman, her life of hardship and toil. Living in the Hill Country, so we're clear about this, ladies especially, but also gentlemen as well who are watching this. Living in the Hill Country of Texas or anywhere prior to electrification would turn you old fast. In the Hill Country specifically, as we go, a woman who was 20, she starts to look old quickly. By the time she's 30, she looks like she's 40. By the time she's 40, she probably looks like she's 60. Between the weather being outside, no electricity to speak of, no, of course, air conditioning. You may not be all that wealthy, especially if you're the wife of a cotton farmer or something like that who's just scratching out a living. You can't go down and buy this and buy that product to keep you youthful. So you looked worn down, not to mention the fact that people had a lot more children back then. It was not uncommon for a woman to have 3, 4, and 5, and 6 kids. The birth rate was much higher in the 1930s than it is today, and it was especially higher in the 1920s and 10s. The Great Depression tamped down on the birth rate. But compared to today, where people just generally don't have children, compared to their ancestors, it was much, much higher. So a woman was worn down. She looked old. She looked haggard, and she became stooped over time. Why was she stooped, and why was it so hard? First of all, you need to think about what it took to run a house in the middle of the Hill Country or rural Texas during the 1930s and before you had electricity. And the answer is you needed a lot of water. Well, you still need water today, but it's pretty simple to get a hold of water this day and age. So how do you get water? Well, some of you are already answering, you just go to the well. Well, that's true, but so you had to go draw water from a well. Now, hopefully the well's a good well, and it's a deep enough well to get you good water. But just on the offhand chance it's not, where do you get water from then? And the answer should be, for your notes, you could get it in a creek or a river or some sort of flowing stream, or what passes for a flowing stream. Hopefully in the Hill Country you've had enough rainfall at times, and as well as I do, the Hill Country is kind of feast or famine with regard to rainfall, because at times the Hill Country is abundant in rain and the aquifer is close to full, especially when there are less people living that are drawing from the Edwards Aquifer. You might as well write that name down, the Edwards Aquifer. I'll use it when I talk about San Antonio. But the fact of the matter is that when there's less people drawing from it and the rains are abundant, you're not in a prolonged drought, the aquifer is full, and you've got all those springs that today are dried up for the most part because there's so many people who are drawing from the aquifer, draw the water table down. Those springs flow and you get water that way. Springs, to be clear, are kind of like safety relief valves on the pool of water, in this case the Edwards that's under the limestone formations. And so these little springs are little relief valves of water pushing through the cracks. In San Antonio, the San Pedro Springs, which flow when the aquifer gets up to 690. That's a famous one in San Antonio. But there is abundant water in the hill country in the early days, as long as it's not too dry and as long as there's not too many people pulling on the water table. Well, that still doesn't make it answer the question, why is a woman old and she stooped over? Well, because she has to draw water and she has to carry it, especially if it's early in the marriage before the kids are grown up, especially if the boys aren't really grown up just yet. Water's not light. In fact, it is, let me think a second, 8 pounds to the gallon. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. So if you think about your typical orange bucket that you got from Home Depot, or your blue Lowe's bucket, which is a 5-gallon bucket, those things filled for 5 gallons of water are 40 pounds. So think about the fact that they wouldn't have had a Home Depot bucket, but they would have had multiple gallon buckets that they're carrying with them, sometimes by hand. Other times you'll see a yoke over their arms, and they carry it, bring it up from the creek, maybe twice or 3 times a day. Hopefully they've got kids, and they can do that for mama. But early on, probably not. So she has to carry the water. And so you don't build your house, if you're smart, if you don't build your house right on the edge of a creek, because, well, even if it's dry or very placid and beautiful most of the time, and you can go get into it and relax like you do at Garner State Park or there in New Braunfels. The fact of the matter is that you know as well as I do, you will have a thunderstorm come up one night and it rains like crazy there in the hill country, and it flows down the creek or river, and it washes your house away if you're too close. So you keep your house or your lodgings back away from the creek. So you have to carry it maybe a quarter mile. Maybe less, maybe more, just depends on the settings, I suppose. But so mama has to bring that up. She does that several times a day. So there's that. So you don't have electricity to drop a pump into the well. That if you had that, you don't have the electricity to set up a pump and run that water back toward the house and plumb the house. So that's always a big issue right there. So you can't do that. And by the way, you might not have the money to run electricity and buy a pump and a well and do all that sort of fun stuff. So there's that issue altogether. So remember, Texas is a lot poorer back then, 100 years ago. So as far that was the one of my email announcements saying there's a new email. So anyways, so you have that issue as well. And so we got the water, we brought it up. So what are you going to do next with water? Well, let's talk about food. You have to use water to cook with. You're going to have to boil your water. So when you talk about boiling water without electricity, without a range or a stove or propane to do it for you, or natural gas, certainly not going to be there in rural Texas, how do you get your water hot? Well, the answer now becomes, well, you need to chop it. You need to split your firewood. You need to bring firewood in. So ladies and gentlemen, you probably ought to write this down. It is kind of a joke that I say a joke, but a little bit of a relationship or play that I do in a 1301 class, and I talk about how, in this case, it's a Kentuckian in 1790 normally who is a man, and I play the role of the man. It's a cold night out, and the fire's burning big in the house, and he notices the fire is getting a little low in the fireplace, and he sees that there's no more firewood in the house, and he says to his wife, "Honey, go out there and get the firewood." And then he says to her, "Oh, by the way, I forgot to split the firewood, and oh, by the way, I didn't sharpen the axe." And most of the time I ask some willing victim, I say victim jokingly, of course, but I ask some willing victim to help and play the role of my wife. And I try to, as I say this, I would always try to pick someone I think would actually react very poorly to the scenario, because it makes for good class teaching and entertainment value. But it also teaches pretty well too. The difference between 2020 or 2010 or whenever I started telling that story, it wasn't 20 though, but when I started telling it the way I do versus say 1930 in the hill country of Texas or in 1790 Kentucky, is that it was not unheard of and not wrong for a man to say to his wife, honey, you need to split the firewood. I'm sorry, I'm tired. And sometimes it may just be that the husband just doesn't want to do it, and he just says to his wife, honey, you do it. Now, you may bridle at that. You may say that's not right, but I'm not interested here at this point in time to adjudicate right and wrong. That's just the way they did it. It was said by, and I remember seeing the old man say it. He was a Hillcountry veteran. This was in relationship to the Lyndon Johnson congressional year. He said very plainly that it was kind of a received wisdom in the Hillcountry of Texas amongst those folks that a man was a real gentleman who gave his wife a sharpened axe to split firewood with. So ladies, you'd be splitting firewood. You'd sharpen your axe sometimes. Maybe you'd do it all the time if you married the wrong man. And so there you are living in the hill country, firing your stove, your wood-burning stove, with that firewood. Maybe it was cedar, probably not. You're going to try to get a hold of oak or some other wood, but Lord knows, whatever you can get your hands on, sort of thing. So you got to fire your stove to heat the water. You've got to cook with fire, and that can be, of course, a fire hazard. And ladies, you're going to be dressed very differently. I'll talk probably about that more later in this semester. But you're going to be dressed very differently. You're not going to be wearing shorts and a T-shirt. Ladies, you'd be wearing some sort of dress, and those dresses oftentimes went down fairly low to the ground. And even if the woman was somewhat progressive for the 1910s or 20s, she wore a very long dress, and she probably only had one dress or two dresses or three, but not a closet full like many of you who are watching this have a closet full of clothes. But anyways, very different time period. So fire and getting caught on fire was a regular concern and an issue. So she had to split firewood to cook with. She had to heat the water by hand, in a sense. That's hard stuff, and everything's made by scratch. So that if you've ever heard the expression from a family member that goes basically, especially his family lore at this point in time, because they're all dead at this point, basically, is that great-grandma was a heck of a cook. A lot of the reason she was a heck of a cook was because she grew her own garden, and she might even have killed a hog, or maybe the family killed the hog and she had it to prepare and so on. But basically she cooked from scratch because she had to, and so that she developed a cooking style that was, I would say, in a sense, superior to what we have today. Not to say that I'm jonesing to go back to a primitive and pristine past, because I know it wasn't pristine, and it was at times very primitive. But at the same time, I think there was something to be said for the statements that great-grandma or somebody like that, great-aunt Flossie, was a heck of a cook. So you have water for your cooking purposes. You have water, of course, for drinking purposes. Water, what about for bathing? So obviously in Texas, you can skate on this issue a little bit better than you could, say, in Ohio. But in Texas, even in Texas, you're going to want, for bathing purposes, you're going to want warm water there, maybe hot water, depends on the person. Now, admittedly, you're not going to take a bath every day. Those people didn't do that back then. The idea of bathing every day, like I assume everybody, or at least almost everybody watching this does, that's a fairly recent development, because it's just very simple to go and turn on the valve and turn it off, and then the hot water magically appears, and so on. Now, obviously, if you have a flowing stream, you can take a bath in a flowing stream. But if in the hill country of Texas, if it's a spring-fed creek, you know as well as I do, some of you go there in the heat of the summer to get out of the heat, and those streams can feel awfully cold. So you can bathe in the creek. I'm not saying they didn't do that. But if you had, and the thing, though, is that it's not uncommon, actually, to see women, especially if they're particularly worried about being modest, almost prudish in a sense, they may not bathe in a creek because they don't want to disrobe in public like that and expose themselves or have somebody else see it. Wouldn't do that. But I will say this, and I probably shouldn't tell you this story just simply because I ought to save it for a little later, but it wasn't uncommon for Southerners, it wasn't uncommon for women who lived in Let me say this correctly, lived in Behar, a.k.a. San Antonio, the Bejareños, the people of San Antonio, who in 1820 were, or 1830, overwhelmingly Hispanic or Latino. The fact is that it was known that in part of San Antonio, and that San Antonio bathed in public together. They did that sort of thing. So, but most of the people who are going to be living in the hill country are not Latinos. They are going to be German, or they're going to be Anglo, and there's a different coda amongst that culture versus the Latin American culture in San Antonio, just down the road. Anyways, all of which is to say is that a woman would have to heat her water up. And more firewood, more water. You see how this is starting to build up. You might need 20 or 30 gallons or 50 gallons of water, maybe 100 gallons of water on it in a day. And so it obviously, having to carry all this water without electricity giving you the pump to turn it on and turn it off would force you to be quite economical, because you don't want to drag more water up than you absolutely have to. But you also need to get the job done. So you wash yourself, you cook with the water, you bathe with it and all that sort of fun stuff. Something else to consider too. How do you wash your clothes? How do you wash your clothes with water? You have to boil the water to get it hot. And then you have to boil the water to rinse, because you're going to have two separate wash tubs. You're going to have a wash tub that's and a washboard that has got soap in it, and then you're going to have a rinse tub. I mean, just think about your washing machine. It has the soap cycle and the agitation cycle, and it also has the rinse cycle. So nothing surprising there. So anyways, you have those two things. So that's more water. And then what do you do if you got cotton shirts? You washed your husband's shirts and he's out in the field plowing and all that sort of fun stuff. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, you just don't hang it back up in the closet. There's no, at that point in time, to my knowledge, they hadn't developed wrinkle-free clothes. So you have to live with the fact that, well, if you got a cotton shirt, congratulations, you have to go out and you have to, iron your clothes. And so here's that issue of the side irons coming back once again. And so a woman who had those irons, and you can really tell in a sense the poor from the moderately wealthy, I would say wealthy, but more prosperous might be the better way to say it. But you could tell how wealthy or prosperous a person was versus how poor or prosperous they weren't by what type of irons they used. Before electricity, you had to heat your irons, and so you'd have a half a dozen of them. And some of you may have an old barn, some of those old irons laying around the house, or laying around the barn at this point in time, 100 years out of use. Anyways, they are made literally out of iron and cast iron sort of stuff, so they're heavy. So what do? You build the fire and you you build the fire to heat those things up. Well, if the iron is too cold, it does you no good when you're ironing on your board. If the iron is too hot, it burns the few clothes you have. So you have to get it just right. But for a woman who is ironing, a woman who is ironing is going to grab that iron, and hopefully she has a wooden handle, and that's the more prosperous woman, the woman who has the wooden handle. Now she's going to have a towel probably wrapped around that wooden handle, and she's going to go ironing away and do what she has to do. But the poorer woman probably didn't have that wooden handle, and so she would wrap it more securely with a rag or something like that as she goes. But you know as well as I do, some of you who like to cook or cook in the morning, and you do more than just open up a box of cereal and you do a little cooking in the evening, you know those skillet handles, those cast iron lodge skillet handles, particularly that's the cast iron I use, they get hot, and so you have to use a towel to wrap it up. And sometimes you don't, when you got your hand around that towel, you didn't wrap it just perfectly, and sometimes your hand gets a little warm and might get burned a little bit. Those women who cooked and worked in the hill country and also ironed in the hill country, they would have burns, and their hands would look like, I say bricklayer hands, but the idea of well-manicured fingernails and pedicures and hands that are dainty soft and so forth, that did not apply to these women there in the hill country, or even in other parts of rural Texas or beyond. So prior to electricity, it was a hard existence. And if you think about what does electricity do for the woman, it takes her out of the dark ages and brings her to modernity. With electricity in the house, she can, if they can afford it, and people will spend money to buy these things to make life a lot better. They can buy a range that is electric, or later if gas shows up in the form of propane or natural gas in the town, then that right type of range as well. In addition to that, they will buy refrigerators. That was one of the earlier things, so you can keep your milk, so you can keep this and you can keep that. As I said a few minutes ago, if you had a well, you might put a submersible pump in it so you can pump water into the house and have a commode for the first time in your life. And that, I mean, commodes had been around since basically the turn of the century, if not earlier, frankly. But the idea of not having to go to the outhouse, that was a big deal. And that was why you see in some of those old houses, when they first plumbed the house, you would see the commode be put on the porch and it would be walled off and so forth. But that's where it'd be done. And even into the mid-1950s or 60s, you will still see people still using the outhouse because that's all they knew. But anyways, you have plumbing. You have heaters. Just think about the heaters that are going to start to come in, whether it's the form of a propane heater and a classic Dearborn stove, or maybe something akin to an electric heater or something like that. And of course, the thing that is, in a sense, maybe obviously a washing machine. You can think of all the different materials that are available in the house. So it's toaster, the iron, the electric iron, and that sort of stuff, obviously. But the thing, in a sense, most symbolic and, in a sense, most important of what electricity does is it overcomes the night. Because prior to electricity, if you were out there on the farm, you might have a coal oil lamp, or you might have some other lamp. You might have a basic, very primitive lighting system. Probably not just a naked candle burning, but maybe if you were that poor, that's all you had. Anyways, when the sun went down, there was a very good chance that after the sun went down, you didn't hang around you didn't stay up a whole lot of time. You went to bed because you couldn't see anything. You might as well go to sleep and sleep a long time and all that business. But because of electricity and because of light, you can see and stay awake all night long if you want to. And some of you right now watching this are night owls. And so you go to bed at 2 or 3 in the morning, maybe 4 in the morning. Your cycle is flipped upside down, as it were. And so there you go. There were kids who, when they came home and they saw their house lit up for the first time, they literally said, "Mom, Dad, our house is on fire." The early electrification, I mean, you might have a one plug in one room sort of deal. It was not like today where you have a plug on every wall and multiple plugs on every wall. You don't have that. Maybe it was a naked light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Maybe it wasn't. But all to say, though, is that a woman who was able to get electricity into her house in the Hillcountry had a new life. It drug her and brought her out of the distant past and made her modern. She would appreciate that. Her husband would appreciate that. And the man who brought them electricity and the Hillcountry of Texas would receive their votes. And that man's name was Lyndon Johnson. So that's a postscript on the Hillcountry that I wanted to bring to your attention and spend just a few minutes, in fact, about 37 minutes by my count, on the subject. But as we go down the road here, we're going to talk a little bit next about the next major river, and I'm going to skip to San Marcos. I know it's a river, but at the same time, I'll skip it over and keep on going. But I want to get to New Braunfels, and particularly in that case, it is the Guadalupe River. Some of you have been on that over the years. Is at Schlitterbahn there in New Braunfels. Others up around Kerrville or Comfort and floated down the river, or at least spent a lazy afternoon at New Braunfels with an ice chest full of some of you might say cold drinks, others might just say Coca-Cola. But you floated down the Guadalupe River. It was originally named Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe, and it's a spring-fed river. The Guadalupe River is prone to flash floods and flooding. 1998 was one of the worst floods in the history of the Guadalupe River. I was witness to that. Historically, it stands up as one of the worst ever just because of the way the water fell and the rain fell, which was just below Canyon Dam. Canyon Lake and Canyon Dam are one of the great flood controls on that lake. And then you got some smaller little residential or recreational lakes at McQueenie and just outside of Seguin, which is also on the Guadalupe River. But the Guadalupe River is really, like I said, a lot of tourism going to be up and down that river. A lot of tourism going to be in the hill country in a modern sense. Down the river toward Gonzales and down the river toward Victoria, it's far more agricultural, particularly cattle over the years. There's been a lot of cows have drank out of the Guadalupe River, whether in the Spanish period of Texas history or in more modern times. But when we talk about this river, I want to bring in a group of individuals one of the great migratory groups to Texas, and they settle along the banks of the Guadalupe River. And those are the Germans of Texas. The Germans of Texas. And now, to be clear, there are a lot of different ethnic groups in Texas. We're most familiar, racial, ethnic, kind of mixing those together. Obviously, you're most familiar with the Anglos. And you're obviously the good number of black Texans moved here through back in the days of slavery and afterwards as well. Good number of Hispanic Texans. They lived in Texas from the very earliest times in some cases. Others moved far more recently. Texas is quite diverse, as I've already said to you. But beyond the obvious big three, which would basically be Anglo, Black, and Hispanic, the fact is you will have other immigrant groups into Texas. I've mentioned the Vietnamese immigration into Texas in the afterwash of the Vietnam War. That was a big immigration that settled along predominantly Houston and the Texas coast. But also worth noting, too, is in the 19th century, you're going to have several groups, one of which I'm going to focus on now, that are going to settle in Texas, and that is the Germans. You're also going to have Czech and Bohemian. You're also going to have some Poles down around Santa Maria, Czestochowa territory, just southeast of San Antonio, kind of like on the way to Corpus Christi. There's a pretty big Polish settlement down in Karnes County in that part of the world. So some of you may say, why are you skipping mine? Well, I can't talk about everybody and everything, so I'll pick what I wish. And so I'm going to talk about the Germans. So the German migration into Texas really gets going during the Republic of Texas period of time. The Republic of Texas lasted basically from 1836 to 1845. The Republic of Texas was, as I would say, is a failure. It doesn't succeed. Obviously, it wasn't that big of a success. Otherwise, I think Texans would have stayed independent and would have stayed the Republic. But Texans were all too, or Texians as they were known then, were all too happy to go into the federal union with the United States. But in the Republic period and the time after the Republic passes into oblivion and Texas becomes an American state, you're going to see investors out of Germany and leaders out of Germany trying to promote settlement of Germans in Texas. It starts in the 40s and really gets into a crescendo and a high tide in the 1850s and kind of peters out during the American Civil War. But Texas was one of the great attractions for Germans coming here, and it was led by a fellow named Karl Braunfels, Prince Karl Solms Braunfels. Prince Karl of Solms Braunfels, I'll get that name right. New Braunfels is named for this Prince Karl. Prince Karl was a troubled and I would say rambunctious, middling aristocrat of what we'll call Germany. Prince Karl wants to make money, wants to have a military career. He's kind of all over the place, sometimes ready, fire, aim territory. It is going to be Prince Karl and his Verein, which is the company that he helps found with some other investors that are going to establish a German beachhead along the Texas coast. The town's name, you already know it, is called Indianola. Now, to be clear, there are other Germans who are going to come to Texas and never step foot in Indianola. They immigrate to Texas and come in at Galveston. My family, the Giesenschlags, we came in at Galveston. But we also came in the 1850s. In the 1840s, they came through Indianola. If you want to talk about the Germans, and this is what I would have you to write down, the Germans in the entirety of their immigration to Texas, so this would be in the earliest days with the establishment of New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, which is another kind of the end point. There was supposed to be this great German colony out on the western edge of the Hillcountry, out around Comfort and Junction and that part of the world, but really kind of grinds to a halt out at Fredericksburg. That's kind of the western edge of German migration and settlement. If you look at Texas and you look at Texas as it sits today, you would see a couple of sets of migratory patterns where people settled and the namesakes are still there. Now, obviously, over time, a lot of folks moved down the road and moved on. They left the homestead in Schulenburg or LaGrange and they moved off to Dallas. Now, I know that. It's just what people do. But when they come to settle Texas, they settle really in what's called the German Belt. You will have settlers coming up out of Indianola first, and they settle along that route from Indianola up toward basically New Braunfels, and you will find the settlers in New Braunfels who are also going to have people in Seguin, and then kind of trickling all the way down to the coast, say around Cuero and so forth. And oh, by the way, I know there's a lot of Czech descendants in Cuero. I can read a phone book, as they used to say. So I understand this. There were a lot of Germans who came up through Indianola, and what I'm trying to tell you is they would sometimes just settle wherever they found cheap and available land. And that was especially true in the 1850s. And as these Germans would come off the boats at Galveston, many of them were supposed to go out to the Hillcountry. Many of them were supposed to go out to Fredericksburg or westward. But why travel all the way out there when you can find cheap and available land in Washington County, Texas, or you can find cheap and available land in Lee County, which is Giddings, or you can find cheap and available land in Fayette County, or around Houston, or around Seguin in Guadalupe County, or even San Antonio or Bexar County. My point is this, is that a lot of the Germans, they don't make it to the hill country. They start, I say squatting, that's not right. They start dropping their baggage and start settling these little towns, which roughly can be traced along I-10. I don't want to get too carried away and say, oh my gosh, I-10 is it. But basically, about 50 miles on either side of I-10 is the German belt of Texas. And then you get to Seguin and San Antonio, and then you bear northwestward into the hill country toward Fredericksburg. So, I mean, if you look, if you're familiar with that part of the world, Green Hall it would be an example. I mean, that's New Braunfels, basically. If you look at the names of San Antonio, and some of you are from San Antonio, not every name in San Antonio is either Johnson, Smith, Jones, Garcia, Gonzalez, or whatever. It's not just Anglo and Hispanic is my point. The names on the streets of San Antonio, there's like a dozen Wurzbachs. And Wurzbach is about as German as it can be. I mean, Wurzbach, Wurzbach Parkway, Wurzbach, this, that, and the other. Walsham, Eisenhower, and the Eisenhower in San Antonio, there off the east side that I'm thinking of, right close to HEB Distributor, is not Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. It's a different name. It's spelled differently. And I mean, you look through the city of San Antonio, and you can see a ton of names that are German. That's part of the story of the city of San Antonio. Is that there's a big in the 19th and early 20th century. There is a big faction of the population of San Antonio that is German. In fact, actually, I'll just go ahead and say it now. I can kind of mix these lectures together. Sometimes I'm more specific, less so, and others. But San Antonio, to give you an idea how kind of a three-way city it was up until probably World War II, is where I'd say it switches and really becomes what you see it in a modern sense, is that it's worth noting that in San Antonio, the city of San Antonio at the turn of the 20th century, even into the mid-20th century, you have three major Catholic churches in downtown San Antonio. Now, I realize there are others out on the farther flung edges of town. St. Patrick's on the east side, off of Highway, it's going to be I-35 nowadays, it comes to mind. But when we talk about Catholic churches, yes, everybody who is a Catholic is under the headship of the Pope at Rome, and you know that, or if you're Catholic. However, not everybody who is Catholic wants to go to church with everybody else. It's kind of the idea of birds of the same feather flock together. You may just say that's not right, not fair, not good. I don't know that I disagree. I don't know that I agree with that or disagree. I kind of ambivalent some days. But the fact of the matter is it's just a fact of life, I think, that a lot of people at times like to live next to each other, who look alike, think alike, act alike, etc., especially when they're more or less recent immigrants. So in San Antonio, around the turn of the 20th century, or up until about World War II, you're going to have three major churches in downtown San Antonio. And for those of you who know San Antonio well, you're thinking, San Fernando. which was a church back then before it was a cathedral. San Antonio did not get a bishopric until I think the 1960s or 70s. I'd have to check. But it was just a church, San Fernando Church, which was the church predominantly Hispanic, directed toward that portion of the San Antonio community. It had services in English and in Spanish. The other two is St. Mary's in downtown San Antonio. That was the Anglo-Catholic Church, and obviously services will be done in English for the most part. And then there's St. Joseph's Catholic Church in downtown as well, which was dedicated for the German Catholics, and they were doing their services in German. If you're wondering where St. Joseph's is today, find the River Center Mall, and there's a department store. At least they might all be bulldozed at some point in the day and age we live in because of malls going by the wayside. But there's a church that has got, basically it's got a department store on three sides of it, and it's sometimes over the years been known by the locals as St. Joski's. But St. Joseph's was the German Catholic Church. So you have essentially, if you've got three Catholic churches in downtown and almost eyesight of each other, and they're all speaking different languages, and back in the day it was all in Latin for the Mass, that ought to tell you the diversity of the community. I think it's fair to say that it's not completely in thirds, but basically up until about World War II, San Antonio from the 1850s, or it's going to be 1870s or so to about 1940 is going to be roughly divided into thirds: a third German, a third Hispanic, a third Anglo. And so that's there's a big San Antonio contingency of the German presence. I mean, heck. Pioneer Flour Mill was German-owned. Memory serves also Lone Star Beer was German-owned. In addition, Pearl was, I recall, German-owned. Of course, Pearl's out of business, and who would drink that anyways? It was just colored water. It's my recollection of Pearl. But my point is this, is that you have German beer left and right. If you're talking about German beer, so many of you are familiar with Shiner Bock or the various Shiner types. The Spetzel Brewery there in Shiner, Texas. So anyways, all continuing along here, but they travel and they drop. What really tended to make a German drop his baggage and set up shop in this town or that had to be basically two things. One was land available, and was it cheap? And number that live here. And there's so many Germans migrating to the United States in the pre-Civil War era. Outside of the Irish, it's the greatest migration prior to the Civil War. Over 1 million Germans, or almost 1 million Germans, are going to migrate to the United States, many to Texas in this time period. And they come from all over Germany: Bavaria, Hesse, Saxony, Prussia, and so on and so on. So if you're traveling through and you start to talk to these different Germans and you find out, oh, these are people like me. They're not just German, but they're Prussian. Oh, I found the new fatherland, or something like that. They settle up and set up shop. Others would keep going, and they would find out, oh, these are our people, and they live over around Seguin, and so they drop their baggage and set up shop there and buy the land cheap. My family were Prussian, not nobility or anything, but we were Prussian, and we set up shop in Washington County, and then eventually moved to Burleson County because we were kind of hunters, and we liked to shoot things. And there was a lot more game in Burleson County by the 1870s than there was in Washington County, where we were in Brenham and Burton. Anyways, and by the way, so we're clear about this, not every community that has an Anglo name in this belt is going to be dominated by the Anglos. Some are, some aren't. For example, say Giddings. That was a very German community, very German. Giddings, Texas, which is Lee County. Giddings and Lee County, those are two about as Anglo or English of names as you could ever hope to see. But the thing is that, put this in your notes, up until recently, Lee County was the only county in America, or at least one of about 2 or 3 in America, that was a majority Lutheran county. If you find a bunch of Lutherans, you're going to find a bunch of Germans. That's just a standard fact of historical life, and you find a lot of Lutheran churches. The painted churches around Schulenburg, or some of them are Lutheran, and most of them are frankly Catholic, actually. But the point is, you find a lot of Lutheran churches there. Some of the most prominent Lutheran churches, prominent churches in communities that are, say, Brenham is a Lutheran church. It's not the First Baptist Church. It's not the First Methodist, which would have been an Anglo-dominated community, or the St. Mary's Catholic Church, which would have been a dominant, a Hispanic-dominant community. The Lutheran churches, if they're If they're the dominant church, then that's probably a very German community. So you find them all over the place. They build their houses in the old German style. When they moved to Texas, they loved to bring their food with them. The problem was growing white potatoes, amongst other things, was not very common here and didn't go very well at first. And then they ate sweet potatoes. Of course, other meats and vegetables as well. But as soon as they could start to grow white potatoes, what we think of potatoes for the most part, they ditched the sweet potato like a bad habit. The Germans did not always get along with their neighbors, especially Anglos, it seemed like. Some Anglos complained and groaned that these Germans were too neat, too nice, and they're showing us up. The Germans actually got along fairly well with the Comanches there in the Hillcountry, which is a noteworthy thing. Sometimes it's overblown, in my opinion, about the Comanche-German relationships. The Comanches and the Germans of the Hillcountry did strike a peace treaty, and it did hold. But at the same time, there are days it kind of borders for me on the history of that stuff. It almost borders on the noble savage mythology of that these Comanches in this case were just they were honest as the day is long, and all the problems can be laid at the feet of Anglo settlers. I think that's not true. I think they're very human, just like we're human. But the Germans of Texas, you'll find them by the time you get to the 20th century. You'll find them setting up shop in the form of members of the legislature. The Kemple family comes to mind out of Seguin. And the thing is also, when you talk about the Germans of Texas, some of the great dance halls that some of you have been to or will go to before you get out of A&M. Some of the great dance halls of Texas are German dance halls. The famous one that I always think of is Green, just outside of New Braunfels. But yeah, those are markings of the Germans. So all of which is to say is there was a lot of Germans who settle in Texas. And if you just have your eyes that are open, if, say, driving through Lockhart, you see German signs and German names. Kreitz's Market would be an example of that. That's one of the barbecue joints down there. Lockhart is an English name, but there's a whole lot of German families that live down in that part of the world. But if you have your eyes open, you can see the markings and the leavings behind of the old German movement and settlement of Texas. It's one of the great migratory patterns into Texas. And I think that's at 56 minutes, a good place for us to stop this morning. Thank you.